everyone. Welcome to today's webinar on the topic of supporting our caregivers at work, presented by Elise Cathry with the Alberta Division of the Canadian Mental Health Association, a partner of Wellness Works Canada. So my name is Nicole Hrechka, and I'm with Wellness Works Canada, your nonprofit workplace health and performance association. We support employers and workplace health practitioners in building healthy, high-performing work cultures and specialize in bridging the gap between employee well-being, culture, and workplace performance. We are the only association in Canada that supports workplace health practitioners in this industry. We support our practitioners and employer members with evidence-informed resources, tools, supports, certifications, assessments, surveys, planning, recommendation, and connection. We also have the only accreditation available in Canada for workplace health and performance practitioners. Before we begin today's session, there's one thing I'd like to highlight. So we are very excited to be leading the first of its kind, a workplace health and performance charter for leaders and CEOs. The purpose of the charter is to bring together leaders with a shared commitment and demonstrated action to a culture of health and performance and share this message with other leaders across Canada. Its vision is that employers in Canada are demonstrably committed to supporting employee well-being as a driver of organizational performance, a healthy Canadian population, and a high-performing economy. There are a couple ways to get involved. So by becoming a national ambassador for health and performance, a founding partner, or simply an influencer to help share the word. So please follow up with us afterwards if you'd like to learn more, or go to wellnessworkscanada.ca/charter to sign. So just a bit of housekeeping. The webinar today will be about an hour in length and it will be recorded. So there will be time for a Q&A at the end of the session, but feel free to throw any questions you may have into the chat or Q&A function throughout the session. Without further ado, I'm very pleased to welcome Elise Cathry with the Alberta Division of the Canadian Mental Health Association, a partner of Wellness Works Canada. Elise is a peer support facilitator with Caregiver Connections and has experience working in human resources and coaching. Caregiver Connections is an Alberta-wide peer support program run through the Canadian Mental Health Association. As a peer support facilitator, Elise has lived experience as a caregiver of a loved one with mental health challenges, and through a peer support framework, uses this experience to support others going through a very similar journey. Welcome, Elise. I will now pass it off to you.
Thank you, Nicole. I just realized I'm like exactly the same as this image that I sent, like same shirt, same necklace, same hair. It's funny. So thanks for having me. I'm really excited to be here and chat with everyone about Caregiver Connections, peer support, and the experience of living life as a caregiver. And we'll get into kind of how we define that within CMHA, because obviously there's kind of a broad experience with being a caregiver. And as Nicole mentioned, I'm happy to take questions throughout. I was saying before we jumped on here today that I am a person who likes to ask questions as we go, because otherwise sometimes my brain will lose the context if I have to wait till the end. So more than happy to answer questions as we go. So as Nicole mentioned, I am with the Canadian Mental Health Association, Edmonton region. So I'm employed by the Edmonton region. However, Caregiver Connections is an Alberta overall program. So all of that's funding and things like that. So we'll get into what we're going to talk about today. So overall, I want to just touch on who is a caregiver, how we define caregiving within CMHA, the caregiving experience, and what that can be like, and specifically with regards to caregiving for people with mental health challenges, because there can be some nuanced differences. We'll talk about common caregiver challenges and the impacts of those challenges and how they might show up in our day-to-day lives, but our day-to-day lives includes our workplace. And so how moving into how we can support employees, or even if it's personally loved ones that you have, people that you know in your circle, how to support them if they're going through a caregiving experience that you're aware of. And then we'll get into a little bit about our program at CMHA and what that looks like and how we support caregivers, what peer support is and some of the benefits that are seen from that. I'll give a list of common resources that are available for caregivers. So, you know, should you be in interaction with somebody who's a caregiver, you can rely on that list of resources to just refer them. And just some of the feedback that we hear about our program. And then we'll go into some questions and my contact information. Okay, so getting right into it, who is a caregiver? So for the purposes of CMHA, we define caregiver as anyone who's supporting a loved one with diagnosed or undiagnosed mental illness or challenges. So that can look like, we have folks that join us who have loved ones who have very specific diagnoses. Sometimes we have people who they know something's going on and they're going through the diagnosis process, which can be quite challenging and take some time. It also changes, which can be a challenge for people and their experience. And then we also have folks who their loved ones are dealing with addictions or things like that. And then we also have people who it's something called anosognosia, which is essentially they don't realize they're ill. And that's part of the challenge with mental illness, is that one of the fundamental things about it is it tells your brain that you're okay and everything's fine and everything that you're experiencing is real, which it is for them. And yet they don't necessarily realize that there are other things that can help them come back to a more level basis for them and what that would be for them. So the types of caregivers we see, and sorry, I should just note, obviously caregivers can come in a lot of shapes and sizes and experiences. And so what that can be is, we have many of us know caregivers of, their elderly parents, say, or, loved ones that have illness, more of a physical focus. For the purposes of today's conversation, we're going to be talking about the specific mental health focused caregivers. And we also see a lot of different types of caregivers. So people often come to me and they'll say, I'm not a parent of somebody, but it's my husband or my partner, or it's my best friend or my sibling, those types of things. So we see parents, we see spouses and children, adult children use our services, siblings, friends, roommates, all those sorts of things. So for me, my experience, I was a caregiver for my father who had mental health challenges. So all different types. And we'll talk about how, even though they have very different experiences and they're in different roles, so to speak, there's so much crossover in how they relate to one another and how they experience these situations. And I should say too, it doesn't require somebody to be living with them either. That's a question I get a lot. I did not live with my father, and yet I was still very much his caregiver. So moving into just kind of overall the caregiving experience. So for me, and a lot of the folks that I talk to rather, I really see the caregiving experience as like this really challenging solo trip up a mountain. It can require a lot of energy and a lot of focus. Navigating the mental health system can be a challenging one for a lot of folks. And depending on your socioeconomic status and your diagnoses, where the person is at in their mental health, it can be even like that can really impact how easy or difficult it is to get the supports that you need. And so it requires a lot from the caregiver to really focus on, okay, what's the next step? Where are we going? What do we do? Who do we talk to? And as I'm sure we all know, that really can take a toll on our overall energy and focus from other things. There's a lot of uncertainty and fear because you don't know what the future looks like. You don't know, what your loved ones, the rest of their life is going to look like. It might be different than what you had hoped for them. Usually it is. And so that can really create a lot of uncertainty and fear because we just don't know what to expect for them. You can encounter many roadblocks and challenges, and that's kind of going back to both the mental health system. We are blessed to live in a country where we have universal health care and things like that, and it is not a perfect system. And so especially there's movement and changes and shifting in mental health care, and there's more to do. And so it can be really challenging from that perspective, but it can also be really challenging from the perspective of getting support from other people in your life, because there is a lot of stigma around mental health still. And it can also be really challenging because the person that you're supporting might not always be in a place where they're looking for that support as well. And so it can kind of be this like push-pull situation sometimes. And then, you can experience a lot of isolation, grief, trauma situations, extreme stress. And we'll get a little bit more into what that looks like and why those things come up in the way that they do. I always forget I can't use the button. So some common caregiver challenges. So one of the big ones that I see and we talk about in our program is access to resources for themselves and their loved ones. So again, this is really going to depend if you're searching out a psychologist or specifically a psychologist or say a social worker. A lot of those are for pay services, and so, or their fee services. And so if you don't have benefits to cover those types of things, that can be, you know, seeing a psychologist can be upwards of $200 to $220 an hour. Luckily, there are a lot of psychologists that do offer sliding scales and things like that, so that, you know, you can try and access the services for a little bit less, but it certainly can be a challenge for some people. Same with, you know, long wait times, maybe if they're looking for housing supports, things like that, it can just be hard to find those things. As far as resources for themselves, I find often, and I mean, this was my experience as well, I didn't even look for resources for myself because as a caregiver, I didn't think they existed. I thought it was solely focused on the person with mental health challenges, and therefore I struggled through this experience fairly alone, other than, you know, my small support system. And so that's really unfortunate, because now that I'm in this career and working with CMHA, I'm like, oh gosh, there actually is a lot for caregivers, and we don't have to feel like we're in this alone and that there's nothing for us. Another big one is lack of self-care. So really, and I mean, self-care is a buzzword and we hear it, you know, everywhere, especially in COVID, and it is important. And I think it can look very different from what we see sometimes being shared about in, you know, social media and all those sorts of things. And yet as a caregiver, it's usually the last thing on your priority list. But it's one of the most important, because, you know, we talk so much in our groups about you can't pour from an empty cup. And again, that's kind of a cliche saying that we hear a lot, but it's very true. And I will talk about a little bit about one of my experiences in that space, because I got to a point where I couldn't provide support anymore for my loved one. I couldn't provide support for myself. And so, you know, it's really important that we access those resources where we can, but sometimes it's just last on your priority list. Intense and sometimes conflicting emotions. So, you know, you can, like I said, experience grief, and you can be angry, and you can be so sad, and you can, you know, be hopeless and feeling like I just can't do this anymore. And then on the flip side, I love my loved ones so much, and I want them to be better, and I want them to have a happy life, and I want them to feel good. And so it's this can be this very push-pull feeling where you're kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place sometimes, or that's how it can feel anyways. And that creates a lot of challenges for people. Sometimes communication with your loved one who you're caregiving for can be really challenging, especially when we're talking about a mental health, somebody that you're caregiving for with mental health issues. Sometimes that communication breakdown happens very quickly, and it can really take a toll on the relationship. So then not only is the person not necessarily getting the supports that you'd like for them, but they also aren't talking to you anymore, or they're not willing to open up about their experiences anymore. And that can really cause a lot of challenges for people. Isolation and lack of support for a caregiver is, I think, one of the most predominant things that I experienced, but also the folks that I work with experience. And that is because, well, I think it's a couple of reasons. One, when you are caregiving for somebody who, say, has a physical illness of some sort, typically, I mean, everybody can be private, and, you know, we might not all share everything and shout it from the rooftops, and that's totally okay. What I find, though, is that people who are caregiving for folks that have physical disabilities or physical challenges or physical health issues, they're almost more willing to share about it because it's more socially accepted. Typically, what happens if somebody says, you know, I'm caregiving for my father who is an addict and has bipolar and is suicidal. Either people like don't know what to say and they get very uncomfortable. Maybe there will be statements of judgment. So like, we'll just, you know, tell them to stop, or well, just don't worry about it. That's not your problem. Or there can be very kind of judgmental, and it's usually coming from a place of, support, they're trying to support you, and they're trying to like take the burden off of you. But unfortunately, it doesn't work that way. And so there's a lot of unsolicited advice that happens. There's a lot of judgment that can happen about, well, you shouldn't be enabling them. You shouldn't be doing this. You shouldn't be doing that. And so oftentimes the caregiver just shuts down, and they're like, you know what, I'm just not going to talk about this because I'm not getting the support that I need. I know whatever you're doing is coming from a good place. And yet I'm not being supported in the way that I want to be. And so people just keep it to themselves. And so one of the biggest things I hear when folks join us in group is, oh my gosh, I'm in a space where everybody understands what I'm going through. And nobody's going to sit there and be like, well, why aren't you doing it this way? Well, just tell them to do this. Those sorts of conversations don't happen, and it becomes a very safe space. And then lack of control. You are trying to support somebody who, is a decision maker in their own lives. So they might not want to go down a support role for themselves. They might not want to look for a diagnosis, or they might not want to go to counseling or get some medication support. That might not be something that they want to do. And so unfortunately, we are all our independent people. And unfortunately, as the caregiver, that can feel really hard because you want to control, because you want to help and you love the person, and yet you can't. It's just not within your scope of control, which is hard. And all that to say, it can all, and usually does at some point, lead to a level of caregiver burnout, where we all know what burnout is, especially, talking from a workplace perspective and talking about employee wellness and things like that. Caregiver burnout is exactly the same thing, where you just hit your max and you are not able to provide support to yourself. You're not able to show up in your life the way that you normally are. And you're not able to support anybody else either, because you're maxed out. And so a lot of these things are very common with the folks that I talk to, and something that I'm really passionate about sharing, because I think we don't realize the impact that it can take. Just gonna take a sip of coffee here. So some of the impacts of these challenges as we, go through our caregiving journey: lack of focus. So you're so focused on, say, if you're at work, is my loved one okay? I'm not with them right now. I should text them. I should call them. I haven't heard from them in a while. What's going on? You're also exhausted. And so, we all know that exhaustion and that kind of lack of wellness really impacts your focus. Sleep issues, doesn't matter how tired you are, sleep issues can become a real problem, because you're laying, the moment your head hits the pillow and you're like, oh, I can't wait to go to sleep tonight. And then your brain's like, oh, hey, here's all of the things you need to worry about. So let's talk about that. And then you can't fall asleep, or you don't necessarily have a solid sleep. Feelings of hopelessness. And that can show up in a lot of different ways, because when we start to feel hopeless about one area of our life, that can really trickle in quite quickly to other areas of our lives. And so we start to see that in our relationships. We start to see that in our work life and all of those sorts of things. We start to withdraw and lose interest. So for me, I'm an extroverted introvert as a baseline. And then when I start to become burnt out, I don't want anything to do with anybody. I don't want to talk. I don't want to, I can't, I don't have the energy. And so I withdraw, I lose interest. And this can, really kind of perpetuate that feeling of isolation. Impatience, irritability, argumentative. So I can see this a lot, both in our personal relationships, but also showing up to work. It's that situation of, the employee who is usually really personable, really, kind of a great person to work with. They show up to work, they do the job, they get along with their coworkers. All of a sudden they're getting snippy with people. They're getting really frustrated. They're sending snarky emails. They're not necessarily taking feedback very well anymore. They're just like, they don't want to hear it. They don't care what you have to say. That can come up a lot. This can also lead to, anxiety and/or depression or other challenges for the caregiver, both physically in illness or mental health challenges, or physical health challenges as well. I know there's a lot of talk about how stress impacts our bodies, or long-term stress rather, and so that can really become a big thing. attendance issues can be something that comes up because either all of the things happen and then you're so maxed out, you're like, I can't get out of bed today. I'm not going to work. And or maybe you're starting to show up later, or you're having to leave work early, or you're taking extended lunch breaks because you're making phone calls and trying to figure out a support for your loved one. So we can start to see a lot of attendance issues and lack of productivity, and really starting to get to a place of not functioning at your normal level. And I think we see that, overall with health issue or mental health issues right now with COVID, and COVID fatigue is real, and Zoom fatigue is real, and here we are. And all of those sorts of things can really play into how you start to show up differently in your life, and not necessarily in a quote unquote positive way. And so for me, my caregiving experience, like I said, I'm an only child. My dad was an only child, and he had addiction issues for much of my life. And that then spiraled into depression issues that were not treated properly by his healthcare practitioner. I think there was some undiagnosed bipolar and things going on, and which eventually led to being in a space of really contemplating suicide quite regularly. And so it got to a point a few years ago where, I had worked in HR for, I think it was like 9 years by that point. So like, I am the person that's managing attendance and doing all of these things. And all of a sudden I'm getting to a place where I am not being productive at work. I'm getting to work and I'm so exhausted, and I'm checking Facebook to see if my father was online because I'm worried about his well-being. I can't get a hold of him. And I'm sitting there, just sitting at my desk, like I've got, 150 emails, and I don't have the space. I'm reading them, I'm trying to do them, and I can't deal with them. So my productivity suffered, my client relations suffered, which I had pretty good relationships with my clients. So that was good, because at least I kind of hope they knew that, there was other things going on. I was in a situation where I was reporting to somebody new. So I really didn't have, I'm a pretty open person and I'll share a lot with people, but I really didn't have a rapport with him. And so it was new, and I was hesitant to go in and be like, hey, here's all my stuff going on. At that time too, I kind of saw it, I loved my father very much. And yet I saw it as like a baggage. I didn't want people to think it was a weakness, even though it was impacting the way I was showing up in the world. And I truly don't see it as a weakness for people, but that was where my head was at, was people are going to see me differently. Or if I share too much about this, it might, my family is going to be upset about it. Or I don't want to talk too much about it to my friends because I don't want to be the downer. I just, everybody else is good. So like, I'll just deal with it myself. And it built and built and built and built. And my attendance suffered, my productivity suffered, the way who I was at work suffered, as far as how I showed up and interacted with my coworkers. I had a short fuse, and I was so anxious and so stressed all the time. I couldn't regulate myself. And it came to a place where, my father was having a really challenging bout with suicide. And I was getting phone calls from either him or the RCMP or some of the healthcare lines, like almost daily, because it was a constant thing. And it got to a point where I had to go to my boss, and I was grateful for the fact that he could see that I probably wasn't acting in my normal way. And even though I hadn't really shared a whole lot with him, and I said, I need to go off for a bit. And I had to take a vacation, and I didn't share what it was about. So I ended up just taking vacation. But I'm grateful that he was willing to give me some of that space, because I needed to not be at work. And I wasn't being a good employee, and I've always been a good employee, I think. And I wasn't then. And so it really became a tricky situation. And it then became hard for me to go back to work, because I was afraid of judgment, and I was afraid that people were going to think differently of me if I shared about what was going on, or any of those sorts of things. So it really it takes on a life of its own sometimes. And it doesn't always for people, but it can. And I think it's important that we start to be aware of what the life of a caregiver can be like, so we can start to support them a little bit better. Let's pause. Are there any questions or anything? I saw something pop up, so I don't know.
So Ruth Ann just mentioned that presenteeism is related to mental health challenges, whether it's caregiver or the self.
Mhm.
It's a huge productivity drain in organizations, and I think that's a really good point, Ruth Ann.
Yeah, yeah, 100%. I was definitely functioning in presenteeism, very much so. And, I think, and I think sometimes the distinguishing factor with being a caregiver is that people don't always understand that being a caregiver can relate to the mental health issue for yourself. And so that's where it's like, well, you're just caregiving though. It's not you experiencing the thing. And yes, fair. And through that caregiving experience, I then have those mental health challenges myself. So yes, thank you. 100% agree. So, okay, what do we do if we have an employee or a loved one? It doesn't even have to be an employee or somebody we work with, but somebody in our circle that is a caregiver. So we'll talk about some do's and don'ts. Don't expect their productivity, their coping, their personality to be as they normally are, because there's a lot more going on under the surface. And you probably, you might have a close relationship and there might be a lot of sharing and openness. And if that is the case, then that's great. And I encourage you to foster that relationship. But if you don't have all the details, know that you're just knowing the tip of the iceberg and there's a lot more that's going on. Don't give unsolicited advice on what they should do. I hear so many people in my groups and my clients say, my friend just told me to just kick them out, or just don't give them the money, or don't do this, or you should do this. And while it's probably coming from a loving place, it's probably, maybe there are points of truth in there or valid advice. It's probably something they've heard before. It's probably something the caregiver has thought before, and it's not that helpful because it actually just makes you feel judged if you don't do what they do. It's a very intricate situation. And so it's not just as simple as like, oh, well, they're not following my rules and they have addictions issues, so I'm going to just kick them out. It's just not that simple. And sometimes people have a hard time understanding that. Don't punish them. This is outside of their control and they're likely doing the best they can. And so then by being punished in whatever way that looks like, is going to make it worse, 100%. Don't dig for information on their situation. They will share what they're comfortable with. Letting them know though that you are a safe space. And that's where I kind of said fostering that relationship of, if you ever want to share more, or, you need a space for somebody to listen, I'm here to do that. But asking detailed questions and things like that can, sometimes if you know the person well and maybe, they're willing to open up, they will, but usually they'll share whatever they're comfortable with. And we're likely gauging how you're reacting. So we'll give you a tidbit and then it's like, okay, are you going to judge, or are you going to give me advice, or are you just going to hold space for me? Okay, we're just listening. Cool. Then I might open up a little bit more. So just know that by creating a safe space, they'll share what they're comfortable with. And really ask for the support that they need. Don't treat them differently than any other mental health or health challenged employee. So I think sometimes we can look at, somebody, an employee or a loved one who has a physical illness, and it can be easier to distinguish what that looks like. Oh, you are struggling, you had heart surgery, therefore you need to be off work for this amount of time. Here's, no questions asked. For people with mental health, I think that used to be not so much the case. I think now, because of some of the strides forward as far as stigma and things like that, it is that's starting to become better. And I know employers support employees who are having mental health challenges. There is still stigma around it though. And so really remembering that if somebody is in a caregiving relationship, and they're really in the depths of that, they likely have mental health challenges. They're probably not saying it, or they're at minimum going to have extreme wellness challenges at some point or another. And so being able to see, this is a challenge that you're having, and it's outside of your control, and it's not something that you can just turn off and turn on, needs to be considered within the relationship and how you treat them. So what do you do? It's important that you be understanding of the impacts that it can have on their mental health, their work life, and their productivity. So, you don't necessarily, I think it is important to communicate that in some way, depending on the relationship that you have, obviously, and how you are interacting with them, and in what form, like supervisor, employee, coworker, employee, that sort of thing. I was really grateful to have, I had a new supervisor, but I had the most wonderful team of people that I had worked with for quite a long time, one of them being one of my best friends. And so she did know a lot about what was going on in my life. And her and a few of the other people really circled around me to say, whatever you need, we're here. Like, are you feeling super overwhelmed and you need to pass some work off to us? We'll help you out. Are you, your brain's not functioning very well today and you don't know how to answer this question that you normally would know? Don't feel bad about asking us. We are here to support you. We know you're great at your job. We know that you care, but we also know there's a lot going on for you. And that alone felt like, okay, I'm not in this work life on my own. I don't have to completely suffer on my own. Give them space to share if they wish to. So again, it's that really opening up the conversation to say, I know there's a lot going on for you right now. I'm here if you ever need to talk about it. But no pressure, sort of thing. Because obviously it's personal and they're not required to say anything if they don't want to. I think it's really important to be as flexible and supportive as the employer allows. So I know that that's different for everybody and what that looks like, and every organization is a little bit different. Sometimes that might look like going on vacation for a while, maybe taking a medical leave, maybe taking an unpaid leave, things like that. Maybe there's some ability for a short period of time to switch job requirements around, or provide more of a team approach to things so that that person's capacity is taken into consideration on a daily basis. This can also look like changes with the schedule. So, if I'm every morning having to spend time checking in on my dad, I'm sometimes late. And so can I have a little flexibility that if I, show up a half an hour later than I normally do, I'll take an hour off of my lunch, or I'll work a little bit later, or I'll tag it on to another day. So however that can look. And again, I know that that's different for every employer, but just giving that ability to say, like, we know that there's something going on. How can we support you as the employer in your work life? This is obvious for most leaders and HR professionals, but encouraging them to access benefits and resources. As many of us know, people tend to not. There's a real underutilization of benefits, and I hope that's changed maybe in COVID year, but I know when I was in HR, it was very much the case. And so use EFAP, use, if you have a counseling dollar amount that you can use through your benefits, get involved in those sorts of things because they're there for you. We're paying for them as the employer. You're paying maybe a benefit or a premium for them. Let them help you, because they will. Having a conversation about what they need. So, how can I support you? What would be helpful for you? What do you need right now? Is it an ear? Is it flexibility? Let's just have a conversation about it. Even the ability to feel heard and, again, helping to decrease that isolation can feel like a huge weight off your shoulders. Creating an environment where they're comfortable to share their experiences. And so this is really, I would say, almost a proactive thing, and something that I know a lot of leaders, organizations, HR professionals strive for, is let's create a culture of safety within our organization, a culture where when people are going through challenging times, they're supported, they already feel like they can share. So as I said, I was in a kind of a weird situation where I had a new supervisor. So by no means was he not like this. He absolutely was. I just didn't have that rapport with him yet. But I'm so grateful that I did have a group of colleagues that we had already existed in that culture together. And so I did feel supported by them, even if it was, they're not going to change my job requirements, or they're not going to give me the flexibility within my schedule. But just knowing that I was going to work, and if I was having an off day, I could talk to somebody about it, was extremely beneficial for me. And then it also ensuring there's no judgment for their situation or the supports they need. I do feel that there is still, as much as we want to say that there isn't, or it is getting better, yes, there is still stigma around mental health issues. And there is stigma around the impacts of caregiving, and that people don't realize how all-encompassing it can be. And especially if you've never experienced it, you just think like, okay, well, that's them. So just, help them when you need to, and move on with your life. And it's just not that simple, especially when we're talking about, situations where you could lose that person, or there could be severe impacts from the loved one's experience, both to you as well as them. And so that can really be a scary thing when you feel like, are people going to judge me for taking time away, when it's not actually my issue, when in all reality, as a caregiver, it very much is your issue in your life as well. Okay, so that's kind of the overall caregiving experience, and like as an employer, what you might see, or as a coworker, HR professional, what you might see. Are there any kind of questions on that? I'm going to go into the second piece around what Caregiver Connections within CMHA offers to caregivers. No? Okay, cool. Well, if something comes up, jump in. So overall, Caregiver Connections is a program within CMHA Edmonton. So as I mentioned, it is found across Alberta, and there are other caregiving programs throughout Alberta as well as the country. So I know we can sometimes get people on these webinars from not just Alberta, so I will caveat that. But within regards to Caregiver Connections, we are a peer support group to help parents, partners, and caregivers of those with mental health concerns and or addiction to come together and support one another. So that looks like we have a drop-in peer support group as well as one-on-one peer support. And I'll get into what that looks like. So what is peer support? I think it's something that's becoming a little bit more talked about and popular, and I'm happy to hear that because I think it's a really beneficial thing. So it's emotional and practical support between two people who share a common experience such as mental health challenge or illness. And then a peer facilitator is somebody who has lived through that similar experience and is trained to support others. So one of the job requirements when I applied to this job was, do you have experience caregiving for a loved one with mental illness? Yes, I did. And so then you are then trained to support people through those experiences.
Elise, I just have a question here in the chat. So are people from other provinces able to attend or access the Caregiver Connection program in Alberta?
So it depends. I mean, it's weird right now because normally we're in person. So right now we're online. So really, I mean, anybody could attend. The challenge is that there's not a hard no that people can't attend, but the challenge is that we talk a lot about local resources. But what I would say is if there are people outside of the province that are interested in attending something, connect with me and I'll have my contact information, and I'm sure Victoria and all the good folks will send that all out. But connect with me because we can find something for you, I'm sure. If the Alberta ones aren't the best fit, because there are a lot of specific mental health focused organizations, or diagnosis rather. So say the Schizophrenia Society, they have a caregiver support program for caregivers of loved ones with schizophrenia. So those pop up all over the place and are available for people, not just in Alberta. So would be happy to connect you with any of those resources. So some of the benefits of peer support. So it's supportive, encouragement, and hope. It helps to decrease those feelings of isolation, which honestly is the #1 piece of feedback that I get from people that access our supports. I'll talk a little bit about some of the other things that I've seen with them though, because it's really been wonderful. I've only been in this role a little over a year now. And so seeing some of the people shift and grow and the way that they just show up differently has really given me so much faith in the support and the true benefits of peer support. One of the beautiful things is that it's equal. There's no uneven power dynamics. Sometimes people get afraid of counseling or things like that because there can almost feel like there's a power dynamic. There shouldn't be, but it can feel that way. With peer support, we're all just people. We're all just peers. We're all caregivers in this context, experiencing a similar life experience. And so we talk about that. And there's no like, I am the facilitator and I know all of the things. Like, no, we're all together and I'm just holding space. I'm holding the space for everybody. It's a safe space for those in similar situations. So again, you're coming into a room of people and it can be very scary when you're, especially online, coming into a group of people that you have no idea who they are. And you're going to talk about some of the most vulnerable, scary, hard things you've ever been through. And yet people open up, because as soon as they start hearing everybody else share, they're like, oh my gosh, it's not just me. I thought I was in this all by myself, when really you're absolutely not. We'll talk a lot about resources and strategies, which can help people both for their own caregiving, self-care, but also connect them to resources for their loved ones. And it really fosters a self-efficacy, empowerment, and engagement, which is one that I have really seen in people. This energy that they show up with has changed, and they're able to then start to focus on self-care more. They're able to start to focus on, moving their own life forward as well, because sometimes our life as a caregiver goes completely on pause while we're looking after someone. But in reality, like, we still deserve to have a happy, beautiful life too. So it's really the benefits I can't say enough about. So right now, so the DropIn Group, we're online. We used to be in person. I think I started, fully in the role last January, and I think we did like 6 weeks of in person and kiboshed it because of COVID. So now we're online, and honestly, the program has taken off. I'm really proud of how it's morphed and changed over the last year or so. So we meet Thursday evenings from 6:30 to 8 p.m. On Zoom, as everybody is right now. And anyone who's new that wants to attend, I have them contact me first, and I do kind of an intake process, because it is trickier online. There's a different dynamic. And so I like to orient people so that they know what to expect, they know what they're coming into, make sure we've got the technology thing all figured out, and we don't have any issues with that. And so we do have a semi-registration process for the online format. When we're in person, people just show up any Thursday that they want to. I don't know who's coming. I don't know if somebody's new or if it's just all returning folks that are coming. With online, though, there is a level of, we want to ensure that we're really creating a safe space, because it's a little bit trickier to navigate that if things don't go well. And so that's where I like to, it's registration in the sense that I send out an email every Monday to my ongoing attendees and anybody who I've done an intake process with, and say, hey, if you want to come on Thursday, let me know. And they do. And if they can't make it, or they don't want to attend in the end, or something comes up, they just don't come. And that's totally okay. There's not, they're not taking a spot away from anybody else or anything like that. So it's kind of pseudo registration, but it's not in the sense of like you're paying or you're committed to coming or anything like that. It's just so that I know who to send the Zoom link out to that's unique, as well as ensure that there's some safety in the room, so I know who to expect. It's facilitated by myself, as well as a colleague of mine who is an advocacy and wayfinding coordinator. So she's amazing as far as resources and connecting people to things in the community that we probably would have had no idea about otherwise. So it's a really great kind of dynamic that is going on there. We do a group check-in, we talk about support, and I have to say the level of, like, I guess by nature as caregivers, we're primed to support one another, and yet they're just the most lovely group of humans, and they're so supportive of each other, and tears are shed sometimes, and 90% of the time I leave our Thursday meetings just my heart feeling so full, because I see the impact of people who are going through similar situations supporting one another, allowing space for them to cry, allowing space for them to really vulnerably share the intimate details of something that they usually don't want to talk about, or they don't feel safe to talk about. And it's just such a beautiful dynamic. If we have time, sometimes we have a big enough group that we talk the whole time, and that's great. I love that. Sometimes we'll have an educational topic, or a little like, let's talk about self-care. I try and make it new and fresh, so we're not just talking about like Googleable things, and try to make it really conversational. Because again, even if I am teaching something, it's more I'm presenting a idea or a thought, or maybe something that they can do to support themselves, and then like, let's talk about the reality of this and what this might actually look like. So it's very open, it's very fluid, and very supportive, and just I want it to be supportive to the people who are attending, and whatever that looks like. We also do one-to-one peer support. So usually that's on Mondays and Wednesdays, and via phone or Zoom or whatever people are comfortable with. And it's kind of the same thing as the drop-in group. It's the same type of conversation. It's just one-on-one. And that can look a bunch of different reasons. One, people might not be able to make the Thursday evenings, but they still want that support. Some people aren't super comfortable in a group setting, and so that one-on-one dynamic is a little bit more supportive for them. But basically the same kind of format or way of supporting one another. A lot less informal though. We kind of just go with it and see what they need that day. And then within our program, we also do community education. So events like this, we'll talk to parent groups, schools, anyone in the healthcare system, community groups, business, advocacy, any of that good stuff. So if any of your organizations are interested in connecting with me to hear more about it or to have this presented specifically to their organization, I'm happy to do that. And it's not just about caregivers, but also, self-care, mental well-being, stress management, things like that are all things we can talk about. So putting that out there if anybody's interested. So a lot of the topics that we address within group are, it kind of comes and goes. And this is both formal topics, but also just the things that I hear a lot. So managing stress. How do I exist in this world while I'm carrying around all of this stuff that is weighing on my mind and my body all day, every day? And so how can we support ourselves in that to prevent burnout, essentially? We talk a lot about family dynamics. Boundary setting is a really challenging one as a caregiver because you want to set boundaries, or maybe you don't even know that you need to, but it's important. And yet it's tricky. It's tricky for any of us, let alone somebody who's in a caregiving relationship. There's some added challenges with that are tricky to navigate. We'll talk about communication skills, mindset shifts. We refer to the 3 C's. I think almost every week that I've hosted a group, the 3 C's comes up. And that's almost a mantra or a reminder of we didn't cause the mental health challenge, we can't control it, and we can't cure it. We get so caught up in these, like, what if I had just done this differently? Maybe if I could just make them go to, an AA meeting, then things would happen. Maybe if I could just get them on the right meds, that this would all go away. We have to remind ourselves as caregivers, we don't have that scope of control. And so it honestly, I think it comes up every week. Either I repeat it or one of my wonderful attendees does. Oh, what happened? We also want to really talk about recovery because, people come to our group in the depths of challenge. They're not coming because life's great and my caregiver or the person I'm caregiving for is good now. Usually they're coming because they're desperate and they need support. But we also encourage people especially who have attended before, who are in that phase of, things are good and recovery is possible, to remind people of that, to share those stories because it is possible, it can happen, and it doesn't necessarily have to be like this forever. And even though it feels like it might. And so really having those conversations is important. And then we also talk a lot about navigating supports and services. That's where my colleague comes in, and she's amazing with making sure that people are connected. And they can also connect with her one-on-one as well for her advocacy and wayfinding support services too. And so, yeah, this is just some common resources. So there's tons of a fair amount of resources within CMHA Edmonton. So we always try and connect people with those. Things like Access 24/7 is a mental health support for anybody. So if you're a caregiver and really having a hard time, or you're somebody with a mental health challenge, accessing them is really important. There's a wonderful organization called FAMI, Families Supporting Adults with Mental Illness. They are a not-for-profit, separate of CMHA, but I work with them quite regularly, and they do some education sessions sometimes. They've got a few training courses. They host weekend events and conferences sometimes, so they're a really great resource to connect with. There's also Caregivers Alberta. They are more focused on caregiving overall. So it tends to be more focused around physical caregiving versus mental health caregiving. But still they have some amazing education topics. They've got some great resources there. Again, the 3 C's. We talk a lot about LEAP training in a wonderful book called I'm Not Sick, I Don't Need Help by Dr. Xavier Amador. And he is a psychiatrist who had a brother with schizophrenia, I believe. And he created a framework for communicating with loved ones with mental illness who have anosognosia, which is the I'm not sick, nothing's wrong with me. I don't need your help. I don't need medication. I don't need anything. And yet they are in the depths of a schizophrenia experience or bipolar or whatever it might be. So he's got a really beautiful book, and FAMI offers the LEAP training to help people improve their communication skills with their loved ones. As I mentioned, there's diagnosis specific peer support. So that can be found both across the province as well as across the country, as well as general ones are across the country as well. There's a beautiful organization called Sash Bear Family Connections. They, well, Sash Bear is the organization. Family Connections is a program that's based on DBT, a type of therapy, and it's a program for caregivers to help build relationships with their loved ones through mental health challenges. So those are just a few common resources that we talk about. There's tons more. Again, I'm happy to connect with anyone who's looking for some more information, and we can get you set up with any of those things. So just a couple slides on feedback. You know, as I mentioned, a lot of people, I won't read them word for word, but a lot of people really come back to me saying that they're just so grateful that they found the group. Usually it's either through a referral from someone in the mental health system, or they're Googling and they're desperate for support and they come across us and what we're offering. And it fosters this place, the space of belonging, and the space of you're in a safe environment where you can just share open and vulnerably. A lot of people say their Thursday night drop-in group is a form of self-care for them. It's them giving themselves the space to just be held in a container of I'm supported and I'm with people that are experiencing the same things as me. As you know, the top comment here, we do laugh. Melissa and I try and, you know, we'll have little jokes, and I facilitate from home. I have 2 dogs that, you know, snore and run around, and one walks across the desk every now and again. So we like to keep it light and offer some laughter amidst some of the tears that can come out sometimes in group. And yeah, it's been really wonderful to see the impacts that it's had on some of our longer term attendees that have joined us. Questions? Anything else? I see you, Nicole, but I don't know if there's any other questions coming in. No? I think you're muted, sorry.
Oh, if anybody does have questions, we have a couple minutes here.
While if anything's coming in, I'll just mention so how to connect with me. So I am part-time in this organization, and I'm working Mondays and Wednesdays, and then Thursday evenings I have our group. So always send me an email. You can give me a call, but email usually is easier, and then we can set up a time to chat. So anytime, reach out if you have any questions about resources, the program, caregiving experience, any of that good stuff. I'm happy to chat.
Okay, well, I don't think there is any more questions.
Okay.
So I just want to thank everyone for attending today's session. We will be following up with a few resources, as we mentioned at the beginning. In addition, please join us for a complimentary webinar to hear from Victoria, our founder at WellnessWorks Canada, tomorrow on how to improve productivity through well-being at a partner webinar with the Progressive Contractors Association at 9:30 a.m. Mountain Time. And then next week, we will have another webinar. It's going to be a really good one, Building Resilience in Challenging Times. So I just want to thank everyone again, and have a great rest of your day. And thank you, Elise, so much.
Thank you.